Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get underway. My name is Noel Latif. I am president of the Foreign Policy Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this very important lecture. Professor Osler, I am pleased that the Foreign Policy Association is once again co-sponsoring this important lecture series with SUNY. We are fortunate indeed to have as our speaker today the Honorable Andrew Gilmour, the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights at the United Nations. I'm taken by a quote attributed to the late Kofi Annan, who said, "Human rights are African rights, they are also Asian rights, they are European rights, they are American rights, they belong to no government, they are limited to no continent, for they are fundamental to humankind itself." End of quote. Regardless of latitude or longitude, we all have a stake in advancing human rights, and I am delighted that our speaker today is the point person for advancing human rights in the UN system. To formally introduce him, I'm going to turn to Professor Osler.
Hello, everybody. I would like to all welcome you to the SUNY Global Center. And I am the director of the SUNY Global Engagement Program in New York City, and I love to do a shameless plug for our program here every year. This is a program where my students are in the room. They come, they live in the city, and they are from all over the world, and they do internships in a globally engaged place. And they do great work while they are immersing themselves into understanding what they are doing on the ground through a seminar and a research colloquium that gives them the engagement that's necessary. This year, our students are hard at work in global engagement, from assisting the judges at the United States Court of Trade to combating human trafficking in New York State, to advocating for women's reproductive rights at the Center for Reproductive Rights and for disability rights, et cetera, et cetera. I'm so proud that at this, I'm so proud of our students, because at this time, when everybody is turning parochial and inward and nationalist, our students are combating that through their cosmopolitan attitude and a commitment to global citizenship. And I want to thank the SUNY Global Center for hosting us in this room tonight. They always generously give us the room. I really appreciate the Chancellor's generosity on that. And before I introduce our speaker tonight, I also want to say thank you to Noel, who has been a very big supporter of our program. He was the first one to take my students as an intern, and when I remember having the meeting in his room, in his office, and he said, "Of course I would take your students." And I'm like, okay, I can do this. I can really do this. And so now we have students who are working for him at the Foreign Policy Association, all the way to United Nations Development Program, right? So we're kind of taking over. SUNY is taking over the global engagement in New York City, so watch out. This is our third speaker together, and it's all around the UN. But this year is special because it is the 70th anniversary of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that's an important document for me. It's an important document for me as a person, but also as an activist on the side. I'm an activist for Amnesty International USA. And the choice today was not a coincidence. I promised that I would not read your bio, and I'm not going to. You can read it all for yourselves. But I can tell you why I was inspired to invite him as a speaker today. As a human rights activist in practice and a teacher of the United Nations, I've been troubled by the fact that human rights, one of the three pillars of the United Nations, along with development and human security, has been siloed in its own corner. It has been ignored as if it's something that's different or separate from development and security agendas. And I find that to be troubling. And Assistant Secretary General Gilmour has been one of those outspoken advocates by bringing out human rights frameworks from their silos and trying to mainstreaming it into human rights United Nations processes. His work on Human Rights Upfront initiative is an example of that. He's also been an avid, outspoken person on funding for human rights, and this is an important factor that we all should be paying attention to. We need more funding for mainstreaming human rights into our everyday activities. I have a lot of questions for you, and I don't want to take up more time, so I am looking forward to your reflections on where we are with UDHR 70 years later, and an interactive discussion. I encourage all of you to ask him tough questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Noel and Ilgur. I'm actually incredibly impressed that so many, and very grateful actually, that so many students have come out. I do know that I never went to lectures at 6 o'clock, and it was very much, we've been clashing with drinking time. But I wouldn't, although I'm the same age as him, I wouldn't want you to think that I shared the same habits as Justice Kavanaugh. I was asked, Noel, you slightly oversold me. I'm not the key guy on human rights. That is now a woman, the former president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights based in Geneva. But I do head the UN's work here in New York. So thank you so much for inviting me. I was asked to talk a little bit about the Universal Declaration. Sorry, I thought to put this on. So I want to talk a little bit about the Universal Declaration, a little bit about the challenges to that we face now, and they are massive, as you are all aware, but they really are massive, particularly when you take the long view of it. And then I would like to discuss with you what we can do about it. And in that respect, I will put what I think people can do, but I would like to hear your ideas as well. So the Universal Declaration, which, as we've just heard, we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of, is, in my view, the noblest document ever written. It was done, it was thought of just in the aftermath of the Second World War. But also, the people who were involved in it were very, very conscious of the Great Depression of the 1930s. So it covers the entire spectrum of human rights, political and civil, but also social, economic, and cultural. And it was negotiated with great difficulty. Of course, the most famous one was Eleanor Roosevelt, but there were a lot of other people, and they were not all Westerners. That's a very important point. It was universal. And quite soon afterwards, though, it didn't have, it itself, the Universal Declaration is not a binding treaty. It is just a declaration by the General Assembly. It took years before most of the key rights contained in that magnificent document actually became enshrined in international human rights law. And that's an important point to bear in mind. And it had opposition at the time. The Soviet Union did not vote for it because they didn't like the freedom of movement or the freedom of religion or freedom of thought. Saudi Arabia didn't like it because of the freedom of religion and equal rights for women. And apartheid South Africa didn't like it because equally it didn't like all men are born equal. So it didn't have total consensus, but nobody voted against it. It was still, it was a good moment, but very soon afterwards, the Cold War that had already sort of been building up took away the sort of sense of unity behind it. So although for the next 30 years, not a great deal happened, it would be a mistake to say nothing happened in the areas of human rights. Human rights went in two different directions. The Western powers, led by the United States, focused overwhelmingly on the civil and political rights in it, and the Soviet bloc and the newly decolonized countries focused much more on the economic and social. And it was only really in 1993 that they came together and that they were just, basically human rights were rightly described as indivisible. You couldn't just pick and choose and say, we'll only do socioeconomic ones, or on the other hand, we will only do civil and political ones. So but for a long time, not a great deal was happening. Although in Latin America, clearly there were important developments that set the seeds for the 1970s, which is when things did start happening in the international human rights movement. And a whole series of things came together, perhaps. In Africa, there was obviously tremendous opposition to apartheid. In Latin America, there was opposition to the sort of neoliberal, very harsh dictatorships that were around. And then the third strand was in the Soviet Union, opposition to communist autocracy. But combined with that, there was this feeling in the United States that with the Vietnam War, and also the fact that they were seen to have been plotting coups and propping up right-wing dictatorships, this wasn't good for America's image. So Congress passed the foreign, I can't know what it's called. Can you remember? The Foreign Assistance Act, sorry. And which made that foreign assistance conditional on the recipient observing human rights. So all of these things came together, and I could just give a slight feeling. I joined, and I have a lot of friends from Amnesty here tonight. I joined Amnesty in 1979 as a schoolboy, and the prisoners of conscience that we were assigned is a good indication in a way of how the world looked. We had one Jehovah's Witness in Greece who was imprisoned by the Greek colonels for refusing military service, and on the other hand, we had some poor guy in a psychiatric ward in the Gulag of Siberia because he had opposed the Soviet Union. So, but within 10 years of that, all those regimes had collapsed. There was tremendous, that Greek regime, that number of Latin American dictators had fallen on the one side, and indeed the whole Soviet bloc had fallen as well. And a flourishing of human rights took place. There was, in the next few years, from 40 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, most notably in South Africa. It started in Argentina, but the most notable one was South Africa. There was an enormous surge towards accountability with tribunals in Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, and then the International Criminal Court. And there was the end of proxy wars in Southeast Asia, in Central America, and Southern Africa. All of this led to a flowering of human rights. And I would say it was all going fairly well. There was definitely a march of progress until 9/11. And what happened there was, for understandable reasons, there was the feeling that terrorism was now the great issue to fight against. And in the same way as during the Cold War, the United States and others, but particularly the United States, had decided that communism was to be opposed regardless of the human rights abuses, regardless of, it was, as an Uruguayan diplomat said in 1954, just before the American-backed coup against Arbenz in Guatemala, what is this thing, democracy? Is it that we have to kill it in order to defend it? And I would say that the similar idea that during the Cold War, that fighting communism meant that you would obliterate human rights, because in the US, I would have said it before, that there was always an opposition from 1948, or certainly the early 50s onwards, from the segregationist members of Congress who believed that human rights was going to be a problem if that got international movement, and also the Cold Warriors, because they didn't believe that, they always felt that if one promoted human rights at the expense of right-wing US-backed dictators, that would be a problem for their national interest. So then after 9/11, tremendous violations of human rights took place in the name of countering terrorism. And that hasn't actually stopped since then. And a large number of countries on both sides of the great divide in international relations now of the West and others, a lot of people use terrorism as the justification for very harshly repressing human rights. But I said it was checked in 9/11, but I wouldn't say there was a full-on backlash until a little bit later. Now, I don't know if any of you have read a book that came out in 1991 by Susan Faludi called Backlash, the Undeclared War Against American Women. And what that posited very convincingly was that in the 1980s, there was a lot of pressure to reverse the undeniable gains that feminism had achieved in the 1970s. So that was a full-on backlash. And I would say that we are seeing that now. And I can't actually put a finger on when the actual backlash started, but we now see it in many manifestations. We see the causes of that, I would say, were this fight against terrorism and the fact that the fight against terrorism itself then led to huge flows of refugees and migrants. And then, but there were also in Europe large flows of migrants from Africa, which were not connected to the war on terror. And but all this came together at a time in 2008 when the world economy took a monumental bash, and it was all of this then got conflated, and the austerity programs that got put in place, and in people's minds, refugees and migrants and economic crisis and losing jobs and anger that migrants were coming to take jobs certainly led to Europe, which had in the previous decades taken a front line in pushing human rights around the world, but henceforth in its remarkably ungenerous response, with the extremely important exception of Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2015, but on the whole, Europe reacted very negatively to the refugees and has put forward a whole range of restrictions on them in a way that has not been noted by the rest of the world, who had been accustomed to getting lectures by Europeans as to how they should manage human rights. So we have, how did this manifested itself with ever harsher, what I would call a bovine response to terrorism, which it's almost invariably leads to more terrorists being created than there were when you started the fight against them. And there was, last year, there was a very good report by the UN Development Programme showing that a large majority of former terrorists or extremists who were interviewed used government actions, torturing their brother, assassinating their cousin. All of these things were what drove people into the arms of extremists. So the fight against terror itself became a driver in terrorism itself, and that is a phenomenon. It is also very much related to the discourse at the UN and elsewhere that those who promote human rights are actually sympathizers with terrorism. And this is a growing, and it's a worrying set of discourse. So within Europe, we had some terrible things. We had an Austrian minister saying not long ago that they would put refugee or asylum seekers in concentration camps. I mean, really, was that minister was he not aware that he wasn't the first Austrian to speak about concentration camps? It was other people have talked about in Hungary and Poland the dangers of mixed marriages, things that one read about in the 1870s in this country, now coming back in Europe. And then what I would regard as a particularly bad one, which is when, and again, one understands Italy's predicament because an immense number of migrants have crossed the Mediterranean, and the rest of Europe didn't help Italy share that burden. But one of the consequences of that is that in training the Libyan Coast Guard to pick up the boats, they are handing back to Libyan authorities people who are attempting migration, where they then get unspeakably tortured in various places in Libya. So there are a lot of problems with how Europe has responded to the migration and refugee challenge. We also see a large number of countries. It's almost like copycat countries, laws whereby I'll just mention a few countries of past them: Russia, Israel, Turkey, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, India, passing laws, and Hungary and Austria, passing laws designed to restrict NGOs from being able to operate, either receive funding or from being able to act, or to go around, as in Israel, with a badge saying that you're a foreign agent, to basically humiliate and to undercut them. So there's a major attack on NGOs and human rights NGOs. This is all part of the backlash, I would say. And this horrific, and it's one of the worst manifestations, the scapegoating of minorities, whether it's Central Americans in this country or Muslims here and in Europe, and perhaps the worst case of all would be Myanmar, which I'll come to in a minute. Some of this sort of whipping up scapegoating is so bad that you would get traditional homophobes deciding that actually they will pick up the cause of LGBTI because they believe that Muslims are not seen as tolerant, which I mean, in many cases is not untrue, but suddenly picking up the cause of LGBTI, even though they have had a record of homophobia, because they want to whip up they're more anti-Muslim than they're anti-gay, basically. So they're trying to whip up feelings in that regard. Globally, there is, I mean, even worse than populism, which is this idea that you're speaking for the people and the rest of the elite are not doing so, is majoritarianism. And this is a phenomenon in many countries. It's the idea that the majority is the will of the country, and therefore the rest, people who are not in that majority, do not have the same rights. Of course, we see traces of that here. People like me, middle-aged white guys, believe that we are the majority, and therefore anybody threatening that is somehow not part of the right system. We see it in India, we see it in Israel, we see it in Turkey, Hungary, many instances where the government or a particular group has decided that they are the majority and the rights of others are to be considered less important. And the worst instance of this, and I've spent a lot of time in this in the last year, is Myanmar, where sort of a small minority, under 10% of the population, well under 10%, the Rohingya, had suffered decades of brutal persecution and discrimination, and yet the signs were not picked up that what would then happen would be a full-on expulsion of 700,000 people in a very short space of time at the end of last year, which, if unchecked, will, I believe, be seen as an example. If there's not absolute pressure on the Myanmar government to accept those refugees back, and there isn't, by the way, then other countries can also take the view that it's not enough just to take away the rights of minorities. It's not enough to ensure that they don't get voting cards. It's not enough to ensure that they get less good hospital care, actually an expulsion. So that is something, it is one of the worst events of the last year or more, and it's one that we need to be very vigilant about. At the UN, and my colleagues at Amnesty are very aware of this, there's an alarming politicization of human rights, which is very damaging for the whole human rights movement. What that means is, for example, you get a number of countries, Western and others, saying that what is going on in Syria at the hands of the Syrian government is an abomination, but then they are remarkably silent when it comes to human rights violations carried out by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, or what the Israelis do, or other people. It is, as a former Assistant Secretary of Human Rights said not long ago, human rights is being used as a club to hit people you don't like, and used like a card, a get-out-of-jail-free card to those whose governments you do like, and you're just silent about it. That is a tremendous benefit to those governments in the UN who really do oppose human rights as an international tool, because by proving that human rights are politicized and that some people only take up human rights if you don't like the government who's committing the violations, then that proves the point, which they say very clearly, that human rights is intrinsically politicized and doesn't belong in the Security Council. So the dialogue at the United Nations has a whole range of arguments as to why human rights should not be promoted by people like my office and Amnesty and others. One of which, and China is very clear on, is a principled position. Article 2.7 of the UN Charter says that you should not intervene in matters that fall within the domestic jurisdiction of countries. We take the view that I'm sorry, look, when the drafters of the Charter in 1945 were talking about intervention, they were talking about the Second World War. They were talking about sort of the Blitzkrieg or Barbarossa or the rape of Nanking. I mean, that's what was meant by intervention. My little human rights office making a statement about a demonstration in Xinjiang province is not intervention as the founders of the Charter meant it, but it's still, that is held up. And they are very clear on this, the Chinese government, that if you speak about human rights, you are infringing the Charter if you criticize somebody's human rights record. Others, and we've been accused of this, our office, by governments, of if you support human rights in a country, then you are promoting regime change. A very frequent accusation, and I mentioned earlier, is terrorism. There's often been insinuations that human rights and even the UN Human Rights Office are somehow helping terrorism a little bit by by criticizing governments. But this year, the Turkish government gave an absolutely explicit linkage between my office and terrorism, because if you criticize human rights abuses in Turkey, whether it's in the southeast against the Kurds or whether it's as part of the post-coup of 2 years ago, we are helping terrorism and we are sympathizers with terrorism. There is a feeling, and this goes to your quotation of Kofi Annan, about the universality of values. We're accused of promoting Western values. Somehow promoting anything to do with civil and political rights is a Western agenda. I was very happy to do an event about 2 months ago with Nelson Mandela's granddaughter, his prison letters, and I made the point, I mean, he is a great gift to our cause, because there's been no other world leader in history, probably, who so totally encapsulates all human rights. I mean, try telling him that Article 5 of the Universal Declaration, the right not to be tortured, is somehow a Western right, or to belong to a political party, or the right to have a vote. He clearly was made a huge effort. He wanted to end poverty and discrimination in the economic sphere in his country, but he also was a very strong exponent of civil and political rights. But that is still used against the human rights movement. Somehow it's a Western agenda that doesn't apply to others, as if the right to education or the right to not to be put in prison arbitrarily is only for Westerners. The US argument tends to be, how dare you foreigners criticize our record, and that's pretty explicit as well. There was a report not long ago by the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, and who talked about how extreme poverty in this country was fostered a whole set of denial of human rights, and it got a very explosive reaction from the US administration. So that's the discourse, and maybe the last bit of what I was, and I'm sorry I've spoken too long, or it's just to go through what I think are a few ways in which we can try to confront this backlash. One is defending the defenders. I mean, Amnesty does a great job in this, and so do many other NGOs, but there are not enough of them, and they're under-resourced. Human rights defenders in many parts of the world are under threat in a way that has not been the case so much in the last 30 years. We need to do more. We need to put pressure on their governments. We need to put pressure on your own governments, on the local media. There's a lot that people can do to defend the defenders. Secondly, speaking out. I mean, our office gets a lot of criticism for focusing on naming and shaming, to which the former High Commissioner, Zaid, had a great response. Look, we're not shaming you. He's talking to those countries that massively violate human rights. You're shaming yourselves. The shaming, trust me, doesn't come from us. But the idea that we are calling people out is there's a bit of a backlash against that, and at the UN more than a bit of a backlash, and those of us involved in it are under a lot of fire from a wide range of governments saying enough's enough, stop this naming and shaming, stop this speaking out. But the thing is, it has an impact. I mean, and I know that because a lot of countries that say, look, we don't really care what you think, but the fact that they come in and make such a heavy démarche, the fact that they protest so vociferously against our statements, that they insult us so roundly in the media, shows that somehow it has got under their skin, that it has drawn blood. Speaking out is very, very important. I'm not sure that in the current atmosphere of the UN that there is as much appetite for doing that as there has been in recent years, but in which case people outside the UN are going to have to take up the slack. There are many ways that consumers or NGOs can have an impact. We've seen ways of boycotts. People hate being the recipient of a boycott, but it can send a very, very effective way. There are various ways that have not been really explored. One of which is the of tourism. I would have thought that because a number of countries in the world actually have that are major tourist destinations have pretty terrible human rights records, and I would like there to be some awareness on the part of tourists, and therefore there are ways that one could get to them. That look, you're in this wonderful resort, but down the road there are people being tortured, and particularly when, as sometimes happens, governments justify their brutal methods on the grounds that they have to calm the situation down so that tourists could come. So if they're using that as a reason for cracking down on people, then I would have thought that that's a very good reason why the international human rights movement could use tourism as a tool to try to affect change. Funding is very important, and Ilgur mentioned that, and clearly we need to, I would hope, put more pressure on governments to give us funding, but maybe there'll be questions on that. Mass solidarity is very important. There was it was a great moment in 2015 when Germans went to the stations and just spontaneously welcomed refugees off the trains. The women's marches has been very effective. And a moment that I found very moving, and I sometimes actually choke up when I talk about it, was January last year when the Muslim ban came into effect overnight and affecting thousands of people who were in the air at the time and had no idea until they landed what trouble they were going to be in. But thousands of Americans across the country flocked to airports to provide pro bono assistance, water, legal aid, and a whole range of other matters. This is important. It sends a signal. It validates the impression of the US, and it gives it's an important measure. And these mass movements can do a lot. Now is clearly an important moment for resistance. I mean, one can see the Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Enough or Not Again, the last ones on guns in schools. This is a good time. Just going to bookshops, you see the number of books now that are on matters like this, trying to whip up legitimately concerns. Is authoritarianism coming to America? A whole range of book titles as to how to resist, actually. And we need to use this universal declaration. We need to get people to understand that human rights is for everyone, because unfortunately in some places the fact that the human rights movement has focused on people who really do need help, whether it's prisoners or LGBTI or disabled and various other groups or migrants, that people who are not LGBTI, disabled or migrants take the view, okay, well, I'm not really affected by this. The human rights movement as a whole, I think, has to be much better at human rights education, getting people to understand, the whole populations, the whole electorates to understand that a backlash against human rights, which is what we're living through, is tremendously damaging to all of them. So, and then one of my last points is we need to, I said how important naming and shaming is, but again in human rights we need to show that we do more than that. Now, one example that I'm quite fond of, it was 1 year ago, we convened an event at the General Assembly on non-coercive interrogation. Because traditionally, law enforcement and human rights are seen as antipathetic and different poles. But the aim of this meeting, I think it achieved it, was to show how they are compatible. Because what it did, it had, for example, an interrogator from Guantanamo, and who gave some very, very good examples of how torturing people, forget the immorality and the illegality of it, which we don't forget, but just for the sake of this argument, let's forget it. It's profoundly ineffective because people under torture, it's been proven again and again, will say absolutely anything, understandably, to stop the pain. So these examples will be shown of how people under very serious pressure, the US has never admitted that it was torture, but gave very faulty information. Then we had an interrogator from Norway who showed that showing some empathy for a man, even an absolute mass killer, who may not necessarily deserve too much empathy, but showing it is tactically very wise because they have given out much, much more information as a result of being treated reasonably civilizedly than if they just being so beaten up. So therefore, naming shame is important, but also getting other people to understand how human rights isn't just some moral goal, but actually is a positive gain. And technology. I was in a meeting this morning with Microsoft, and we need to reach out to the technology companies. We are doing it a bit, but you'll be aware that how in many countries there's an increased surveillance against human rights defenders, so that any website you visit they know, the authorities know, and if you look at too many of the wrong ones, they will come and visit you, and then who knows what happens after that. There is surveillance, and then there's also finding out that there's also massive disinformation. We have an expert on that in the audience, Janine Giovanni, who's doing a story on how the Russian government has done a major disinformation program on a humanitarian group called the White Helmets, and how many people's views have changed as a result of an extremely successful disinformation program. But then there's also ways that people are being arrested, human rights defenders, because your phone is picked up off you, and if it's proven that you've taken photographs of policemen beating up crowds or other such matters, or forwarding them to Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, you are in deep trouble. So there are ways that the technology companies can help human rights defenders stay ahead of the sort of the deeply surveillance state. So that's concludes what I wanted to say. I mean, I believe there are essentially two massive threats. There are many others, but two, the biggest ones. Climate change is one, which I'm not here to talk about. The other is this backlash against human rights and this growth of populism and majoritarianism, and this, which is always, in every case, connected to the search for a scapegoat. And in every case, scapegoats are found from among the most vulnerable groups in society, and this is a troubling phenomenon. But anyway, thank you so much for listening to me.
Yes, go ahead.
Is it on now? Oh, wow, it is. Look at that. I have two questions. I'll make them quick. One is, there's lots of... oh, sorry.
Can you introduce yourself first?
Oh, my name is Rick Armstrong. I teach at Kingsborough Community College, part of the City University of New York.
Could you step a little bit back from the microphone?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, okay. Like this? Is that better? Okay. Okay. Rick Armstrong, Kingsborough Community College, part of the City University of New York. A lot of the peacekeeping missions have involved... Is that it? Okay, that's it. All right. You know myself. Have involved human rights abuses. Is there any internal sort of critique of UN institutions that you engage in based on that? And also, how much do you work with dissidents on the ground in certain countries? I'm not sure what you would do, but do you work with dissidents on the ground, I guess?
We are acutely aware. I mean, there's one human rights abuse that happens much more than all others put together, and that's sexual exploitation and abuse. And we take it incredibly seriously, morally, but frankly also politically, because it is so deeply damaging to the reputation of the organization. And of course, people who hate the UN anyway are very happy to use this. So for every reason, we are deeply opposed to it. I mean, it is extremely difficult because UN peacekeeping operations, not everybody knows this audience will know that, but I've had to explain it in less knowledgeable audiences. They're not UN troops. They're on loan from their country for 6 months, and they don't come under UN laws, they don't come under UN military justice, and in many countries, sexual exploitation by military is not frowned on by military authorities. And so there's immense measures going through. We're working really, I can't tell you how hard we are working on it. There's so many meetings as to what we can do, how we can put pressure on the troop contributing countries to actually do something about it, rather than just whisk this. If we have very good evidence that somebody did that, look, we've got his name and everything like that, sometimes they just get whisked away back to their country, and we don't know if there has been justice followed up or not. But we are following up with those countries to make sure. We are trying so hard to stamp it out because it has created huge difficulties. Isha, you may want to say something about that if it's time, yeah. Would you like to say something about that? Isha is with Amnesty now, but she was head of the human rights component in of the UN operation in Darfur.
Just to add that, since the 90s, I think the UN has, and DPKO, which is the Department of Peacekeeping, has instituted specialized offices to deal with sexual exploitation and abuse. across the whole of the missions that it deploys out. And I agree with you that the military police or the civilians who are found to engage, there are rules to deal with that. But more importantly, recently, the UN has established the office that Jane Connors runs, which is now looking at how do you then respond to victims. We're looking at perpetrators, but we've not looked enough on victims, and there's a special office now established to look at what the UN can do with regards to victims, and that flows from incidents in Haiti and other locations where the UN has been found wanting. So we have now covered the whole spectrum, as it were. Thank you.
And your second question is, do we talk to dissidents? Yes, we do. We also are aware that in some countries talking to them is not good for them, so we're very careful. And in some countries, I'll take South Sudan as an example. We know that they have the government has the most highly advanced electronic surveillance equipment given to them by the Israeli government, and they can listen in to our conversations, they can listen in to anybody else's. So we've had to warn human rights defenders, don't talk to us on the phone, because if you do, you'll get picked up and possibly killed. So we're very mindful that about not or do no harm principle, basically. This is what we do what we can, and we had, we had, when Islamic State, Daesh, was in control of Mosul, there were some extraordinarily brave people from Mosul telephoning our office in Baghdad, telling us what was going on. And but if they were found having done that, they were instantly executed on the spot. And so dissident. Dissident is slightly a 1970s word, but opponents of the regime in many countries do talk to us. And we try. I actually have a particular role beyond the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. In terms of, I'm the focal point for the whole UN system of reprisals. Those who are punished for having cooperated with the UN. So, and I spend a lot of time dealing with that.
Hello, thank you for your speak. My name is Fatih Çüngürlü. I'm from Turkey, studying in Hungary. Therefore, I'm quite interested in human rights in general. My question is quite a counterfactual question, actually. It's, so what sort of world we would have seen if the declaration hadn't existed at all? What does this declaration, what does it change in general? What does it say to us?
If it hadn't existed, well, there's a human rights scholar, I can't remember if it's at Yale or not, called Samuel Moyne, who basically takes the view that anything that happened before the 70s in the area of human rights was unimportant. But then there are other people who would take the view that the Universal Declaration was important, even though no dramatic progress happened in much of the world until the 70s. It's set the roots and planted the seeds that people were able to build on. So, I think that, and then it then led to a number of human rights treaties whether it's for the disabled or for migrants or for against racial discrimination, and I think it was incredibly important. It was because without that foundation, I don't think we would have seen what we then saw later. So. What was the second part of your question? The one was what would have happened without it? Well,
So my question is what would happen without it? You wouldn't be, I don't know. So what kind of changes we had seen after this declaration had been? Sorry, this declaration had been went out, or so. If it didn't happen, would we be seeing some, I don't know, more atrocities in Syria, or worse things in Balkans happened in the 90s? Like, so what kind of things changes?
I assume that everything would have been slightly worse. Okay, nothing could be worse than Syria right now. I agree. And just because there have been the continuation of atrocities doesn't mean that there has actually, the number of wars has actually declined quite a lot. The number of people globally killed in wars is less than it was 20 years ago, quite a lot less, and that itself was less than what it was 40 years ago. But the progress was very slow. I mean, it was like a tree, you plant it. I mean, nothing happened. Well, not that much happened for quite a while. I mean, little traces, but only it sort of sprouted in the 70s. And now that tree is being buffeted by winds and many other phenomena, and I'm worried about it. But I think there wouldn't have been that flowering of human rights had it not been for the Universal Declaration.
Reza Fahari, I'm on the board of Amnesty International. Speaking of backlash or challenges to human rights. So I was paying attention to President Trump at the UN. He opposed globalism in favor of patriotism. So sovereign independence is valued by him. Global interdependence is not. So in terms of framing, especially for our students, the reality out there is that we are in a highly global interdependent world. And so would you argue that an enlightened patriotism is really seeing your own national interest in the larger humankind interest? Do you see that as the true globalism or as the true patriotism? Because the fact is that we are all interconnected, and to come and frame it like we are sovereign, independent, we don't care about the rest of the world, would you consider that framing as the greatest challenge that we are facing currently from a country that has always been an ally of human rights?
I wouldn't accept the United States has always been an ally of human rights.
Well, I mean,
but I get the point. And yes, I mean, the word human rights, the two words human rights did not appear in President Trump's speech at any point, and it was a long speech too. And you're absolutely right. He stressed patriotism, and there was a great British thinker of the 18th century who said patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. Dr. Johnson said that. And patriots, a bit of what you call enlightened patriotism is one thing. Full-throated nationalism and unwillingness to work with others is something entirely different, and there's nothing enlightened about that. Yes, I do believe that the most patriotic thing to do is to put away some extreme nationalism and to work in partnership with others. Clearly, that is in the self-interest, but of everybody, if people could see that. So that is the trend at the moment on the part of many countries. I mean, actually, just before this meeting, I had a discussion with a colleague on the front row. President Macron, on the same day, gave a radically different speech, talking about, which was a lot more enlightened in terms of working together. But I mean, I'm happy to talk wider issues, but within the human rights sphere, which is what I'm working on now, the two threats that have put human rights on the back foot are, one, the security argument, and I talked about that a bit, how everybody says, if you support human rights, you're undermining security, although we take exactly the opposite view. We actually think you're going to have far greater success in promoting security if you actually observe the rights of people rather than marginalizing against people who already feel discriminated against. So there is the security argument, but there's the sovereignty argument, and that has grown up. a lot in the last couple of years. And what that leads people to say, the Secretary General has said, we are living in a crisis of multilateralism. People, and clearly the US would be exhibit A in this, do not believe, as they used to, that working together in a partnership with a lot of other countries is the best way of solving problems. But you won't be surprised to know that I disagree with that. Yeah. So it is a major threat. It doesn't mean it's forever, though. I mean, there can be these things go in phases, and one hopes that that enlightened self-interest, that enlightened patriotism will kick in at some point. And I think it will, but the question is how much damage is done before that is the case.
Hi, Chloe Grafe. I'm a teacher at Herrick's High School in Long Island. I brought some of my students, and I run a Model UN program. And we were talking actually about the declaration today, and I was interested to see that you didn't mention the Human Rights Council in your talk at all. And I wondered if you could speak about how that works with that, because our students are often having to simulate roles in those types of organs, and I'd be interested in how it works with what's happened.
No, thank you. I didn't mean to not talk about it. It wasn't deliberate.
Oh, it was
and sorry. So the Human Rights Council is under major fire in this country. There's a sort of pattern of denigration of it. I would take the view that in many ways it is a much more effective organ than the Security Council, precisely because it doesn't have the veto in it. It has taken action in the last couple of years on Syria, where there's no action taken, on Yemen, on the Arab-Israeli conflict, on Myanmar, on Burundi, on North Korea, all of these issues, which because of every one of those 6 countries' issues that I just mentioned, there's a veto. In 4 of the cases, it's Russia or China, and in 2 of them, it's the US, and in the case of Yemen, with the British and French. So, and they're all massive human rights challenges, and political ones, but it hasn't been possible to see progress in any of them at the Security Council. The Human Rights Council, for all its flaws, and nobody, even we, wouldn't say that it's without its flaws, but at least it's possible to get somewhere. And that is an argument I would like people in this country to be more aware of, because yes, it does criticize Israel a lot, no question about it, but that has become the emblematic issue in the eyes of many Americans, that somehow, because it criticizes Israel, therefore it's an illegitimate organization, and that is highly unfortunate, because it does a lot of extremely good work too. So thank you for bringing to my attention that I'd forgotten to mention it.
Just detailing one of those examples in terms of an action that it's been able to take?
Yeah, last week, 2 weeks ago, it issued 2 reports, one on Yemen and one on Myanmar, and they're devastating reports, the information in it as to who has carried out what abuses, and they are going to lead to, I mean, at least it's possible now to discuss these issues and to come out with something. So what we're now trying to do on Myanmar is to have what was created also for Syria, but again, not the Security Council, because the Security Council was unable to reach agreement for it. It's called the IIIM, Independent, Impartial, Investigative Mechanism for Syria, to allow people to investigate what went wrong. So we're trying to set up something like that now for Myanmar, so that can be, it's justiciable information that could be used in a future investigation before the evidence has all evaporated. And so the fact that the Human Rights Council is able to commission these reports that are extremely professional and cover a lot of information and profoundly upset the perpetrators who say it's unfair and protest bitterly is a form of progress. And these are just 2 of the most recent ones.
Thank you.
Hi. My name is Kirsa, and I'm part of the Global Engagement Program here at the Global Center.
Interning at?
What?
Interning at? You're interning at?
Oh, sorry. I'm interning at the UNDPI Visitor Center and Speakers Bureau. I was wondering if, with the reports of human rights abuses, even preceding the genocide in Myanmar of the Rohingya. Could you speak some to the role of the UN in the crisis?
It is, yeah, we've been working on it for many years. And I went there once last year after the terrible, actually earlier this year, to Cox's Bazar anyway. We knew terrible things were going on there. Normally, the problem with the UN, or the problem with the international community, is that there's no lack of early warning. Normally, we have a lot of warning and just nobody does anything about it. It's lack of early action, not lack of early warning. A number of us, and I'm one of them, feels very bad that we knew that there was this grotesque level of discrimination against the Rohingya, and it had been for decades, and it was intensifying over a 30-year period, and it had got really, really bad in the last 3 or 4 years, and there was a terrible bloodletting in 2012 as well, and then a lesser one in 2016, but the horror was last September. I don't think any of us quite realized that they were going to actually expel 700,000 people, and that the ethnic cleansing has been continuing since then, but on a much lower level because most of the people have now left. And so in the Security Council, as I just said in my answer to my last question, it's very hard to get proper consideration of the situation. To personalize it to me, the Security Council doesn't want to hear from me. So they had to, it's a coincidence that it's my nationality, British. The British are the penholder on Myanmar, but they wanted human rights in there. The only way I'm allowed in there is not to go and give a briefing, because the Chinese and Russians won't agree to that, but is that I sit there and then somebody says, I see Andrew's there. Since you're in the room, can we take advantage of your presence and ask you your situation? I mean, that is to that level. You're not asking on Syria, but earlier this year, in April, the High Commissioner for Human Rights on Syria, which in my view is the greatest humanitarian crisis of our generation, he was unable to speak on human rights because we couldn't get 9 votes. The French, who were leading that, and the Americans, couldn't get 9 votes in the Security Council to allow a human rights briefing on Syria for even 10 minutes. So, and that has a knock-on effect in all the rest of the UN as well, including in those who are asked with mediation, because they have to report to the Security Council. And when you've got very, very strong allies of the Myanmar government on the Security Council who do not want to hear any criticism of it, or let alone any actions that could discourage the Myanmar government from taking the actions which they then did, then it's very hard to have that leverage. So it's not a glorious story for us at all, at any level. We knew things were bad. We didn't know they would get quite that bad. But even if we had, I don't know if we would have prevailed upon those governments in the Council to actually take any action to stop it.
Hannah? Hi, I'm Hannah Roska. I'm an executive intern with the Foreign Policy Association and am a student in the Global Engagement Program. As a student, I hear from a lot of my peers that they want to speak out against human rights violations and other issues that they want to help bring a positive change to the world, but they feel that they can't because they're young and a lot of society won't listen or take them seriously, but they still want to do something to help. What would you say to those students?
That's interesting. I haven't come across that. I would say our generation has made such a phenomenal mess of the world. It's up to you to please speak up and please get on with it. And don't allow anybody to tell you otherwise. I mean, that is a... I know there are some cultures, more than here, where there's with tremendous respect for elders, but we're not talking about that here. I would not countenance that way of thinking at all. Please, speak up.
Can you turn on your mic and then
Can you hear me? My name is Patricia Goldstone. I'm the author of several books, including one on tourism and foreign policy. And you raised a question in your talk that I find fascinating, and that is, how do you keep human rights from being used as a political football? The example that springs immediately to mind is the Magnitsky Act, which on the face of it is a very noble piece of legislation, but when you draw back the curtain a bit, there are a number of actors with very questionable motives involved. How do you deal with something like that as an organization?
Well, I mean, the key thing to know about the UN is that it's a political organization. So even when we're speaking on human rights, we come under very, very substantial political pressures. We try and attack everybody and for human rights violations, and as a way of showing that we're not politicized. But it doesn't work at all, because everybody who gets attacked then turns around and says, you're politicized. And if you attack our allies, you're politicized. So, I mean, we will be congratulated by the US for speaking up against Syria, for example, or Myanmar. I work closely because I've been very vocal on Burma. But if we speak about Israel, that is just, I mean, serious threat against us. And you watch it, you might get zero funding from us in future. So we just have to navigate that. I mean, we try and not to be too intimidated by people. And we have called out the most powerful member states. We have a very, very tricky relationship with China, because we have spoken out about what's going on in China. And they have taken actions to cut our budget, to stop us speaking, to generally prevent us working effectively. Their now effort is to cut our posts in Darfur, in South Sudan, and Congo, and Mali. They believe, and so do the Russians, that those posts are not really very useful. I personally believe, and I felt this long before I actually joined this particular office on human rights, that the most important development that's happened in the UN in my nearly 3 decades there has been the fact that peacekeeping operations now do work to protect civilians, which they didn't used to do, and they were just there to patrol borders originally and to stop interstate conflict erupting between 2 armies. But now they work to protect civilians from thuggish warlords and terrorist groups. And they have, in every peacekeeping operation, there's a human rights component that's to promote and protect human rights in the countries where peacekeepers are operating. But they are now under attack, and this is partly, we wouldn't be under such attack for those obviously people doing a good job in those countries if we hadn't actually criticized the governments for their own. So I don't actually know how we're going to deal with this, because now there's such a feeling that we have been too outspoken, that we ourselves are having our own backlash within the backlash, in fact, and member states are telling us, cut.
Try to avoid those questions which are very politicized?
Not avoid them altogether. One might moderate a little bit. No, but we've even on the most controversial one, on Israel, we still speak on that, and on China, we speak on that. We got clobbered, I would say clobbered, for speaking out against the separation of mothers and children on the southern border of this country. We knew we were going to, we did, but we pay a price.
We have time for one more question. Ahmad?
Hi, my name is Ahmad Tipu. I'm a senior at SUNY Politics in the Global Engagement Program, and I'm interning with Swarovski in corporate sustainability. I wanted to switch topics a little bit to responsibility to protect. And although it's had, I would say, quite a positive impact on the ability of peacekeeping missions to be effective, most recently, President Putin used it to justify incursions into Crimea. So I was wondering, from your perspective, what is the future of responsibility to protect, seeing that it's been used in such a positive way in one instance and arguably a negative way in the other?
Responsibility to protect is one of the most sort of noble doctrines that have come out of the UN, and Kofi Annan played a major role in that. There was always a lot of fear on the part of countries in the group of 77, the non-aligned, that this could be used in a unipolar world, which is when it was devised, when the Americans were absolutely supreme in the world, that it would be used as an excuse for Western intervention. A big problem with responsibility to protect was what happened in Libya in 2011. Now, and I'm somebody who I wasn't anything to do with that operation, but from afar, I was absolutely in favor of an operation that would stop a massacre of civilians in Benghazi. But what then happened, and so a resolution was passed in the Security Council invoking responsibility to protect, and people on it like who were not at all enthusiastic about intervention, but went along with stopping a massacre, like the South African government and the Russian government went along with it. But then, once that had happened, the Western powers turned to something very different, and they were clearly out to remove Gaddafi from Tripoli. And that did a tremendous disservice to responsibility to protect, because it gave ammunition to all those who opposed it, that actually the real aim of responsibility to protect is to remove regimes you don't like. I mean, I support it very much. I didn't know that Putin had justified it for Crimea. That's incredible, but okay. And because the Russians are not in favor of the doctrine at all, so to invoke it for that is interesting. But I'm not very optimistic about it, but it's a similar. I mean, in fact, I spoke at an event on responsibility to protect just a few days ago, and because it was General Assembly Week, and I had to speak at lots of things. I had to speak on civil society space at the UN. I had to speak on how to get Human Rights and Security Council. I had to speak on preventive diplomacy. I had to speak on responsibility to protect. And actually, my answer in the end was, whatever we try, there's only one real issue that we should be discussing here, is how to get a small group of countries who are adamantly opposed to all of those things I just mentioned, who then persuade other countries who are not so adamantly opposed but have points of leverage that can be used for them to align with them. So, and that is now, I think, in some ways, one of the most defining issues now, because all those things are a bit related. It's blocking civil society space, stopping human rights coming to council, responsibility to protect, preventive diplomacy, all of these things. And it's the same group of countries that are pushing back hard against them, and how we can overcome their reluctance to be actually more enlightened. The enlightened patriotism that one of our colleagues mentioned just now is one of the issues that most need answering, and I don't know how to answer it. That's a pretty vacuous ending, but...
Well, I can end on a positive note, actually.
All right.
Ahmed is one of the students who founded the United Nations Association chapter on our campus, and they do a lot of lobbying of the United States legislature to invest in the United Nations in multilateralism, as well as making sure that U.S. fulfills its responsibilities to the international community. So I would say that, there is that element of one of those key actors, being the United States, at the Security Council, is hearing constantly from the U.S. public that they are interested in investing in becoming more cooperative at the Council. So
Good.
I will end that on that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.